on-demand replay for TMA 2024 is generously sponsored by EAS Consulting Group and Labstat, members of the certified group of companies.
So we're going to look at this from a point of view of regulatory, post-consumer behavior, supply chain, and business concerns. And by supply chain, I'm speaking very broadly here, right? This isn't just inputs into the factory and then out. We're looking at, the entirety of the value chain from stem to stern. And then we're going to turn the mirror around and look at you and your organization. What are some of the cultural risks that maybe you're not even aware of that exist there? So as we get into this, there we go. Okay, on the regulatory side. All right, so we're going to start on the regulatory side first with Shelly and Rachael. Ladies go first there. Yeah, product first. Yep. Yeah, we'll start with the product and then go and then go back that way. So.
Hello. Is it working?
There we go.
All
we
right.
on?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the risk associated with getting your product onto the market, but primarily, because Shelly's going to talk about manufacturing, I'm going to focus on, let's say, requirements versus recommendations when it comes to testing your product. And one of the things that is absolutely critical is that when you are assessing risk associated with testing your products or manufacturing your products, is that you do not assess these risks in isolation. They cannot be done without considering other aspects across different areas of risk, as Chris was just talking about and has the rest of the panel will talk about. But for me, what I'm going to focus on today, because there's a lot to cover, but I have a little bit of time, is the difference and the impact of risks when it comes to requirements and recommendations, and how even if something is a recommendation, how it can impact in a very significant manner a requirement. So for example, using product testing, obviously in PMTA, which was finalized a few years ago, there are requirements for testing. There's requirements for data that have to be submitted to the agency as part of your PMTA. When you submit these, there are recommendations both within PMTA and also in draft guidances for not only how the data should be presented and submitted, but also how the data should be generated. While those are recommendations, and in some instances they are only draft recommendations in the case of the validation and verification of analytical methods guidance that came out a while ago but has not yet been finalized, they are critical components that need to be considered when you're assessing your risks of meeting those requirements. In the instance of generating your HBHC data, it's more complicated than simply trying to decide how many replicates on how many batches you need to do. There are recommendations for that, but borrowing a very simple phrase from a friend of mine who's in the audience, who will be speaking on a compliant marketplace later in this meeting, sometimes when you start wrong, you simply stay wrong. If you do not start in the proper manner, if you do not build the foundation that you need in order to create your application and to have it include high quality data and information that is not only appropriate but trustworthy, then in the end, you may have followed the requirements, but in not following some of the critical recommendations, you will not have the end result that you are looking for. And so the example that I'm going to use for that is just simply validating your methods. And I realize this is not a science discussion, so I'm going to keep it very, very high level here, is that methods when validated or when you are seeking a laboratory to conduct your testing, it is absolutely critical that you use a high quality and a high caliber laboratory. It's a laboratory that has been accredited, but not only that, has taken the extra steps to ensure their quality management systems and to appropriately validate their methods that are being used within their laboratory, and to assure that those methods are fit for purpose for not only your product, but what you're trying to accomplish with the testing of your product, whether it's pre-market, post-market, batch release. It's all critical that the test methods that you use are fit for purpose and that they are appropriately validated for those analyses. In the instance of the guidances that are provided for some of these things, you don't have to agree with them. And I know that it can be a very sensitive point. A lot of people coming from different areas have very clear ideas of how a method needs to be validated or how a product should be tested. It is important, however, that you keep in mind that while a recommendation is not binding, a recommendation is, you can deviate from it, it does represent the agency's thinking on how it should be done. The agency is simply acknowledging that there are situations in which it may be appropriate to deviate from that recommendation. However, if you choose to deviate from that recommendation, I strongly suggest that you have a very clear and very well thought out and supported explanation as to why you chose to deviate from that recommendation. The last thing you want to do is to spend, I don't know, $2 million on an application, submit your data, and have the data not be considered valid or trustworthy. Best case scenario, maybe samples are requested, deficiency letters are sent, additional information is requested. It is, however, possible in some of the review timelines that the agency is facing that it simply would be rejected. So assessing your risk as a whole when it comes to recommendations and requirements, and understanding that just because something is not a requirement is not actually an indication of how important it may be in order for you to submit the appropriate information. It may be a critical foundational underpinning of all of the testing that you're going to do. It is simply not a requirement because the agency recognizes that there are situations where it can be deviated from. So I'm going to stop there and pass it to you because I have no idea how much time I just took up. I don't know.
Sorry, we have a lot of time, don't worry.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think and I think some of those themes will feed into what I'm saying, and some of those recommendations actually probably will become requirements when the TPMPs are finally published. So my name is Shelly Blackwell. I'm with EAS Consulting Group, but prior to joining EAS, I spent about 22 years in industry, all in regulated environments. From the time I graduated college, I was in a manufacturing plant. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how risk management principles apply to the manufacturing side. And there's a few ways that, the biggest and most recent is with the proposed TPMPs that came out last year. So the FDA proposed TPMPs in March of last year. This is tobacco product manufacturing practices. A lot of us know these as GMPs, but they are TPMPs for the tobacco industry. And risk is mentioned throughout. So it's mentioned in the rule itself about 40 times. You'll see the word risk. And the supplemental information that they published along with the rule, it's mentioned about 300 times. So this just tells us that the FDA is placing a lot of emphasis on how you manage and assess and reduce and address risk. In the TPMPs, there's a few sections that stands out. When they talk about facilities and equipment, they speak about how you reduce risk of contamination in your facility and equipment. There's also discussion on assessing the risk of injury to a patient when they talk about non-conforming product. But the biggest area in the TPMPs where they discuss risk is in the design and development section. And so I worked in the medical device industry for many years. If you read that section of the TPMPs, a lot of the language sounds like the risk management that is used in the medical device industry. They talk about assessing design risk, assessing product and production risk, and with the language that's used there, it really tells us that the FDA is expecting that you have formal risk management procedures and processes. And then if you think about inspection readiness, so there are opportunities to reduce your risk of a poor inspection if you're a manufacturer. We strongly recommend that you have an inspection readiness program if you're a manufacturer, where you do things like train your employees on how to interact with an FDA investigator should they show up, that you have procedures developed on inspection management. And then we also strongly recommend that you hire somebody to do a mock inspection. EAS does this, other companies do this, but this is where you'll have trained auditors show up at the manufacturing facility as if they were an FDA investigator, and this really prepares your organization. We have clients so that the FDA has already showed up unannounced, so that's not when you want to be preparing for an inspection. You really want to take the time ahead of time to get ready for that. Even simple things like where are you going to host them, who's going to be their primary point of contact, who's going to work in the back room, what operators on the floor are trained to say and not say to an investigator. So yeah, we can get more into it, but thanks.
How many people from the manufacturing group have ever gone, from manufacturers, have ever been through a mock audit inspection?
A few.
Few. I was, the company I was at used EAS, and we did it in an old factory, and it was humiliating.
We can put on a mean face.
Yeah. It was. It's such a wonderful thing to do though, because when the actual one came around, it was so much less humiliating than what you guys did to us, but in a very good way.
It was
well, you get your money's worth with it. That's what I'm trying to say. But no. But it's really important. But that's a big culture change, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to let outsiders into your manufacturing facility. It's hard to contract a vendor and let them in and just have them dig around. And as we're looking at this, and I know we had a chicken and an egg discussion about, do we do product first, do we do facility first? So staying on the product side, if I can just to get everybody to be able to give an opening, kind of remarks there. Willie, can I go over to you on that, because that idea of the trusted partner inviting somebody in, especially when you're talking about the product side, you want to just elaborate on that? And I think you also have something that you want to say on to that sub matter as well. And then Jessica, I'm going to hit you next.
Yeah, Chris, I hope I remember what it is you want me to say, but you'll give me some clues here. I think, as I think about product authorization, one of the biggest risks is FDA not trusting and believing the data that you submitted, right? And so, as Rachael mentioned, I'll just build off some of the things that you said. When it comes to data, you want a trusted laboratory. Now, I happen to own a lab now since January, but we've been in business since 2000. We're ISO certified, TPMF. We also do GLP studies, which is interesting. There's something very interesting about GLP. GLP in the United States is a little bit different from GLP in other places. And why do I say that? In other places, Canada, et cetera, there's a certifying body. So you can go in and say, show me your certifications. In the US, FDA does not certify labs. They do not do it. So you operate according to GLP, and if FDA thinks what you're doing is so important, they will come and they would audit you, right? We're not on any audit list, so that means either what we're doing is not important or we've been okay since then. And so there's a list of people that have been audited and the outcome of that audit. But we function as GLP, we send information out. And so those are questions that you wanna ask the lab. The other thing I'll say, in terms of inviting people in, if you think about it, you prepare an application and you submit that application and you may not hear anything for a year, year and a half, 2 years. The world is changing, so is the information that's out there. And I would argue that FDA often applies this new way of viewing things and new data to your old application. So if you're not constantly looking at your application and doing a gap analysis or having experts do a gap analysis on some frequency, that's a tremendous risk. So I think that's what you wanted me to say, Chris. I'm not 100% sure.
We don't ask that. We don't put words in our speakers' mouths.
Oh, okay, all right.
I believe in our conversation you really wanted to make that point.
Yeah,
I'm happy here now in front of everyone. If you, yes, Willie, that's what I wanted you to say.
No. No, we always have some spirited discussions, and I, you know, when we're having those discussions, I say, man, I think I want to say that. So Chris is like, we'll say it. I think those are the couple of things I wanted to say about product authorization. Later on, I'll say some things about submission and preparing and what you're actually preparing for.
Jessica, on the product side, especially for what you do, and this is another thing that came up in our kind of organizing call is talking about siloing, right? That everything, we're not looking at risk. We're not even looking at risk. Like, we're in a regulatory silo right now. We've bucketed this discussion out, and then we silo it into different kinds of things where we have product and all that stuff. But when we're talking about product, the behavior, like the use case for the product, it oftentimes it feels to me like we look at it, especially when we're looking at it for a submission, we're not looking at it holistically. We're not looking at it as part and parcel to the development of the product or the product testing. It's like that added layer that gets put on. Can you talk a little, just a little bit about that and what we need to do to get that use case built into the product part of it?
Yeah. So, you know, when we think about what we're facing, pretty much everybody in the room is either conducting research, submitting applications with a goal of getting a product authorized, right? So whether that's a PMTA, MRTPA, SC pathway. And so what we see frequently is, to Chris's point, a silo of a lot of manufacturers and product developing groups is you innovate, you develop your product in one area, and then once you believe it hits a certain milestone, you leverage that and bring that over into now your regulatory structure within your company. And oftentimes, it gets so focused on the next step of a PMTA, right? The next research study, the finding of that, the data of this, that we stop and we fail to stop and say, okay, how does this fit in with the rest of the product portfolio? How does this fit in with what Willie is saying, a change in regulatory advisement? And so when we think about, and we'll speak on this more when it comes to the true risks, I believe, that inherent in the behavioral space later on, I think, but when it comes to this siloing, it really should be understood the entire time until that product is authorized. How are people using it? What kind of people are using it differently? How could it possibly be foreseen by the agency as being misuse? And they're going to be looking at all of those aspects on their application when they're reviewing it. And this, you know, I could talk about a lot, which is that next step of use, which is human factors studies. And how many MDOs have we seen recently where it is actually, it's my most favorite study to conduct, by the way, which are human factors and usability testing. It's completely missing. There's no data for the FDA to be able to interpret. So talk about good data. Sometimes they don't even have any data to be able to say, are consumers going to use this product as intended? Are they going to possibly misuse it? If so, how can you change your labeling? How can you change your packaging? How can you change your use instructions? All of that is obviously, we've seen that as a major risk right now threatening our industry because the research hasn't been done, and companies are being MDO'd. But as part of that, that is when companies will get to these use case behaviors, and we'll be able to then say, when we start to then talk about the risk versus benefit of switching smokers versus bringing in non-users and youth, that's a different risk. But yeah, being able to integrate that throughout your entire process and not siloing out your innovation with your regulatory is really important.
Thank you. Willie, and then I think Gavin.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Actually, William, I was just going to actually add, I think it's a great point you're raising there, Jessica. And it's amazing one of the dynamics, of course, you guys can grasp, since we sell a lot of products online ourselves, we have a huge amount of consumer data within that as regards to exactly how they are evolving within it. And of course, online consumers will always be a little bit different versus others, but when you have 500,000 consumers a month, you get to a sufficiently large consumer base to be able to work through on it. And there's 2 or 3 things which really shocked me when it came to what I'm starting to see coming out of the macro consumer data coming through on it. And this is unique to, of course, I'm only focusing on nicotine pouches, but I assume it's comparable perhaps for other categories as well. I think the first one is, when you start looking at who is recurringly using the products and how many of those have come from more harmful products along the way. And what we can see at the moment, and this actually, people often assume countries are fundamentally different. The data on this is almost identical within the US as regards to what I see within the UK or within Sweden. And for us, we're seeing like 93% of the recurring users have come from some form of more harmful product. I think the second piece, which has really shocked me coming through on this one as well, is the relationship that, and as an individual, this surprised me, but the relationship between flavor and behavior, for example, within it. Okay, I sense you're smiling on this one. I was absolutely blown away, and I went back to my data engineers and data scientists on this to say, no, there's got to be a structural issue on this. And this was about 2.5 years ago when I started looking through enough data sets on this. So if I take some of the things which are viewed as more radical flavors, such as citrus or berry, the findings on those were completely off the chart. So if I take berry, for example, in the same way as 92% of our average consumer base were coming from more harmful products, 97% of the berry consumer base was. And the average age profile for a berry consumer was 4 years older. Our average age profile in the US is 37. So for a berry consumer in general is about 4 years older. And I think that was quite shocking as well. But I think there was a third point which you'd raised, that sort of coming back here to what you were talking about on the behavioral dynamics to it, which is something that I think we haven't fully got our hands around yet when it comes to the complexity of human behavior in this space. And that's the group of people, and I'm seeing this as quite substantial already, but more importantly, it's accelerating, which are what I would refer to as unconscious quitters. So people who, I don't know how many of you in the audience are like myself and as an ex-smoker and regularly went through various stages of, this pack is my last one. The number of people who I come across who've stopped unconsciously in this space, where for one reason or another, they decide that actually I'm going to start using a nicotine pouch today. I think the two primary reasons which I see them starting for is often convenience, often connected to a long-haul flight, I think, along the way as regards to the dynamic in that, and often followed by social stigma from their children, where they do not want to be seen to be taking a cigarette in front of, particularly their children as they're getting in towards adolescence along the way. And then it gets to a stage of, 20% of their consumption is harm-reduced products, then 30, then 40. Then all of a sudden, one day they get out of bed and they realize they haven't had a cigarette in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And I think all of this behavioral dynamics and the underlying data behind it really opens up the door for, are we approaching many of the dynamics within this properly, I think.
Can I just say one thing?
Please.
I absolutely love that and appreciate that. We could probably talk for many days together. But when you say unconscious quitters, what's really interesting about that from a risk standpoint, when we talk about guidances from our regulatory authorities, and we think about, okay, when we set up behavioral studies, we're trying to switch smokers who have a interest in quitting smoking. Well, we see very, very similar. We disagree with that. I think I would fundamentally disagree with it because there's a lot of people who would tell you, I don't want to quit smoking, but when the right product actually is in front of them and they try it, they do. And so it's very interesting when we think about behavior, and as a psychologist myself, it's your affect, right? It's how you feel at that moment. It's your behavior, certainly. And then it's your C, your cognition, it's your thoughts. All of those things are happening right now for each and every one of us, and half of those we aren't even thinking about. So when we talk about behavior change, trying to take a smoker and put down an addictive substance and transition them, we have to consider their feelings, their thoughts, and their behavior, and we have to consider that that changes throughout the day, all day. Right? And so the unconscious quitter 100%, is something that is there and is present and should be considered in the design and conducting of these behavioral type studies.
Chris Roy.
Yes.
When we talk about the product, and we're looking at the regulatory side of it, we don't, especially for tobacco and nicotine products, we don't just have a risk associated with getting and maintaining the product on the market. And I want to get into this, and I want to touch on some things because when we had our organizing discussion, there's a lot that I think we can weave into this on a multidisciplinary approach as well. But one of the things to just tee up for the audit, for the workshop in the first instance is just paint the picture of the regulatory world outside of that the product faces. We're going to stay in the product realm, but the outside of the product authorization world. And then if you can connect that back, because one of the things that I want to talk about when we look at culture change and multidisciplinary, but just keep this in mind, is that when we go back to this, is looking at what that other whole regulatory world that exists there can contribute in terms of a multidisciplinary team looking at risk.
Yeah, when I look at things, I look at I come from the tax side of things, because that's what I've done for 25, 26 years now. But one of the things, once that product gets to market, you have to make sure that your entity has the right licenses, not at the federal level, but at the state and sometimes local levels, so you can actually sell that product around the country. So in some states like Alabama, there's licenses down to the city level, and there's a county, and there's a state license. So it's not just the states that have a role in this. There's several states that are like this, but when you look at this, who is doing the reporting for you? Who's maintaining the licenses for you at these levels? What do they know about excise tax, and are they keeping up with the laws at the local level, the state on down? That in itself takes a lot of my time doing it, but say you're in 6 jurisdictions, how well do you know those 6 jurisdictions? Do you have a good contact at those jurisdictions or states that you can ask questions of? The problem with that is a lot of them have had turnovers in the states and the locals, so you don't have the people that know it as well anymore that used to be there. So now you're asking them a question so you can help reduce your risk, but they don't know the answer either. And so that becomes a problem as well. And and then there's the reporting side of it. Are you reporting the proper tax? And if you do have a new product that comes out, is your sales staff letting the people that are reporting know that there's a new product they need to look for and what that product is, so then they can report it properly? Each state and local jurisdiction have different definitions. So what's moist snuff in one state may not be in moist snuff in another state, or an alternative nicotine product is all different. It may be taxed in some, but not in others. And so when you get down to we had a client that came to us, and they're used to international taxes. And we said, you have to look at the U.S. market as every state is its own, basically, country. And Gavin knows that because that's how they tax it around the world, except for the U.S. We're a little different there.
Yeah. Well, I just find it interesting that, when we look at risk, even at TMA, we talk a lot about the regulatory side, the product side, the submission. That's the existential part of it, right? You have to keep your product on the market, and you have to be able to innovate your product and have it on there. But there's this whole other ecosystem of risk management happening concurrent with that. And so one of the things that I'm really grateful that IGEN was gracious enough to put you forward for this is to talk about that, because I think that because especially when we do gap analysis, especially we look at things, the skill set that you build on that tax side, because it's so detailed, I think is something that we oftentimes companies overlook. And I think that we're not looking at, when we're talking about the product, we're talking about creating a product from stem to stern, and that includes the tax side and how it interacts, and making sure that the product is saleable and legal at the tax level as well. And those skills are immediately transferable, especially in a multidisciplinary team that's looking at risk.
Yeah, and there's record keeping, for both sides of this. I mean, there's record keeping that you have to keep for statute of limitations, both from once you get the product approved, and then you have to resubmit. But even from the tax side, the tax people are very good at keeping records for down the road, because at some point they will get audited.
Yeah.
Most jurisdictions will audit, they have a 3 or 4 year statute of limitations. They try to get out there within those 3 years. Sometimes it's yearly, depends.
Yeah, I think when we get to TPMPs, you and Shelly are going to have a lot of similar processes that you go through between the audit chain and the TPMP chain. Rachael, as lead discussion on this, is there anything else that you want to add on this before we move down the value chain? No? Okay. All right. So we're going to move then to facility, right? And then we're going to look at let's start with the big elephant in the room, which is the inspection risk, both now and what's going to be happening in the future.
Yeah, so I can tell you we have clients where the FDA has said, even though the TPMPs are not yet effective, that when they come back, they will be unofficially auditing to them. So I think that it's really critical if you work in a manufacturing facility that you become knowledgeable so that you can respectfully challenge an FDA investigator should they bring up something that may not be a requirement. Looking at other industries, when new GMPs have come out, you know, there's not experienced investigators in that specific regulation and that specific GMP. So it'll be interesting to see where they draw investigators from when they start doing facility inspections. But so I was hired for a dietary supplement company when the dietary supplement GMPs first came out, and the first inspections that we received were drug investigators. So they had only done drug inspections, and they would ask a lot of questions that were drug requirements that weren't requirements for dietary supplements. So it's really important that you know those requirements in detail so that you have the knowledge to come back to that. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It'll be interesting to see where they draw their personnel from and how they enforce the requirements. Again, pulling from other industries, there's typically a learning curve, both on the FDA side and on industry side. So we'll have to wait and see, but yeah.
Okay. Rachael, you talked a little bit about labs in your opening and validation. When we get to the facility, especially when we're looking at TPMP, batch, QA, all of those issues are a big part of it. How does that link in, and how should you be thinking about your QA process, right? And the lab and the testing that you do with that? How does that link into your submission, and how does that link then into your future submission? And then we'll go down the line, and Willie, I'm going to hit you next.
So it's very closely tied. Shelly and I have talked about this before, but it's absolutely imperative that you are using high quality ingredients, that you are documenting things within your laboratory. If you don't have an in-house lab, if you're not using testing within your facility, that you have reputable third party, that you have certificates of analysis, that you are documenting all of these activities. But one thing I want to just kind of segue into and kind of tie in is that while TPMP is absolutely critical, and for a facility, there are also other requirements that may come into play with future product standards. A lot of the product standards have requirements as far as record keeping and testing and documentation that may in some instances align with TPMP, but it's a little bit of a race to the finish line. Chicken or egg, I guess,
Sure.
Which one will hit first. And so even as you're coming up to speed on TPMP, even if it's just in advance of TPMP, there may be other requirements that are similar but slightly different that you may have to bring online in order to address some of those future product standards as well. And those requirements will have to be done within your facilities in order to ensure that you are releasing products that are compliant as well.
Sure.
Yeah, and a few things on that before we jump ahead. So in the proposed TPMPs, there is a requirement for scientifically valid methods. So you mentioned that. I don't see that coming out of the TPMPs. And not to jump ahead to culture, but the biggest culture shift that we've seen, at least when we've done some mock inspections already, is the documentation aspect. So a lot of manufacturers are doing the right things and they have the right things in their mind, but they're not writing them down. And that's the biggest gap that we've seen so far. And I think that will be the biggest culture change from a manufacturing standpoint because of all the record-keeping requirements that are both in the PMTA final rule and in the proposed TPMPs.
No, I mean, that's absolutely true. You can be doing all of the right things, But if the investigators show up and you can't prove it,
Yep.
Yeah. Or if you can't find it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why practice is important.
absolutely.
Well, and back to the cultural part, you know, being able to, and back to that you know, the audit chain, right? It's an audit chain. Whether you're talking about tax or whether you're talking about anything else, or whether you're talking about this, it's an audit chain. You know, did you take your samples when you run the batch and do it to QA? Is that then accessible? You know, does that correlate to the stamping, right? How does all that, you know, those sometimes we think of those are easy things, but when you pull that out over millions and millions of units across a factory of workers who are, you know, just trying to get the stuff on the line, clean the line, and then move again next, it becomes a different picture. And I think one of the things that we don't realize is how very quickly that can get disorganized.
And workers who have been at facilities for 20 years and know in their head that they're making, you know, a product that's meets standards. It's a big shift to say, yeah, you've been doing that, but now you need to write it all down.
Willie, you have a lab. Oh, Rachel, did you want to say something before we go to work?
I was just going to comment on the fact that all of that, I mean, everything you just said is also running in the back of your mind is a calculation of risk. You know, how do you define your batch? How do you, from buying your supplies to defining your batch to when do you pull samples in your production? All of these things are tied together in an overall calculation of risk. If you buy, you know, and how much risk you're willing to absorb, how much product are you willing to let run before you check and make sure something isn't wrong, how the quality, you know, of your ingredients, how you approach these things cannot be in isolation.
Yeah, and what happens when it doesn't meet the standards? That's the other.
That's
you know,
always fun.
That's the whole. That's the other side of that.
I
Willie,
think
you own a
that-
lab, so I know. Go ahead.
Let me just say something about that. I think that's a true test of culture. We're a tenth of a point outside of our parameters. We've got $100,000 worth of product, or should I say, in some cases, $1 million worth of product that's on the line. What decision do you make? It happens.
Yeah.
Yep.
Who feels empowered to make the decision? Either way. Let's talk about
documenting it.
And documenting it. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. It's easy to lose track very quickly. It feels like these kinds of things almost compile on, and you have to be thinking about it ahead of time when you're looking at your facility. Willie, you have a lab. You also have a regulatory consultancy. When you go in with a client, you look at this. How do you lay this out and say, all right, you want to do this the proper way. You want to minimize your risk here. How do you lay all this out? And how does and I know QA doesn't get a lot of love, but it's so critically important. But how do you lay that out for your clients when you go in and do that?
So quality assurance is critical. In addition to that, I know I mentioned tobacco product master files, but I didn't expand on it. With the master file, especially for methods and validated methods, FDA has typically, when there's an application, they go in and look at those files, right? And so, checkbox. We're not constantly sending in information. Information's there. We have validated reports. Chris, one of the things we do, so we have the lab and we have the consulting arm, and we think there's tremendous synergies there. And for clients that want to take advantage of it, it's there for them. For those that don't, that just want to say, hey, this is the study we want to run, this is how we want to run it, we do that. We typically work with people from the prototype stage, the very beginning, to the regulatory testing, to manufacturing testing, to even when the product is on the market and there are adverse events and you want to determine whether or not your product is associated with those adverse events. So that's typically how we operate.
Jessica, question for you, because I think consumer behavior in this instance often gets overlooked as your post-authorization QA, right? Because you should be doing post-market surveillance and you should be doing post-market studies in anticipation of your life cycle, right? Your product life cycle. Eventually, you're going to need to change your product, and we'll go back through that. And I'm glad, Willie, you also mentioned the point about the linkage between QA and adverse events and submissions as well, because we're gonna circle back on that as well too, because this is one of the reasons why we had that chicken and egg discussion about product versus facility first, because they are very intimately linked, especially from a risk perspective. But Jessica, getting back to the behavioral studies, it often gets overlooked again, or it gets thrown on. It's not a requirement, but it's a best practice, right? You need to understand how your product's performing in the marketplace, and then how that informs that. Can you just give us a little bit more on that topic?
Yeah, and so just to be clear, are you talking about more post-market surveillance work?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Oh.
So I'm looking at it in my analogy here. It's almost like a second. I'm almost comparing it to QA, right? You get your product authorized, you're checking the product quality as it's going out, but then when you're looking at it down the road, that leads back to the submission part of it. But then post-market, what happens there, that leads back to it as well. So that's kind of the tee up. Yep.
Right, and unfortunately, when we look at the post-market surveillance program that the FDA really recommends and asks companies to do, we only have, 23 or 26 e-cigarettes that are currently authorized that have begun that type of program. But it is absolutely fundamental, one of the most critical parts of the entire life cycle, because companies then you have to go back, right, to the FDA, and you have to justify, have adverse events started, increased? Where are they? Are you seeing them at a specific location? Are you seeing them with a specific one-day flavor? Are you seeing them specifically at a nicotine level? Then you're going to go back to your QA processes and say, there's that UPC, there's that SKU, where is that being manufactured? What are those processes looking like? And so it's a circle completely, and that's related to just the adverse events, right? We collect adverse events. Actually, when my medical monitoring team specialist is here, that is part of, in the beginning, when you're innovating, when you're developing your products, you're going to be tracking that. You're going to be tracking that throughout your behavioral module 6 studies, and you're going to be tracking that at the end when your products have been authorized. So that's a key aspect. Another key aspect when we think about their surveillance program is kind of going back to what I just said, which is who's consuming the product. Is anyone using it? Are people reporting dissatisfaction? Is there a product that is continuously rising to the top? Why is it rising to the top? Are they using it with other nicotine and tobacco products? What does their other behavior usage look like? It's not just an authorization, all done. If I were a manufacturer making a product, I would want to know all those answers, because that's then going to help me iterate. It's going to help me improve the next life cycle. It's going to help me develop a brand new product, because now I have insights into consumers who are actually using my product that's been authorized. And again, whether we're talking negative, like I just mentioned about the adverse events, having that QA process in place, making sure all your manufacturing, all your processes are established and consistent and systematic, will allow you to identify a problem sooner. But then you also have the positive side, which is really learning your consumer and your consumer's behavior to, hopefully make you more profitable and more successful.
Yeah. Gavin, there's a lot of risk for a retailer in this. When we talk about products, when we talk about manufacturing, when we talk about processes, can you just give us a taste of the angst that happens when somebody says, hey, there's my product, you guys should carry it?
There is. But actually, even before we get to there, actually, again, sort of feeding on from where Jessica has raised here, and I think it's extremely valid, because what I see in other geographies, where the regulation is not as intense, perhaps, shall we say, as it is here in the US, but has been starting to ramp up, is that you can see much faster moving product life cycles as it comes through. And the pace of change from launching a product to determining what is it within that product that meets the consumer's needs, to taking that back and then reiterating the second generation, third, fourth, fifth generation of it. And just to sort of comprehend how big this is, I would go so far as to say that across our European sales at this point in time, more than 30% of the products we sell today are products which the first unit had not been put in a can 1 year ago. So that indicates what happens when you actually do start iterating and driving that cycle forward heavily. Then reverting back to the question that I was supposed to be answering here along the way. Apologies, Chris.
You can do whatever you want.
So reverting back to that, and as regards to where are the risks. So for us, I think at this point in time, there's not a huge number of manufacturers here in the US. There's a few more starting to manifest across Europe, in many cases quite well experienced and established teams have left some of the larger tobacco companies, launched some venture capital, private equity, and entered in with some very good products within it. For us, and I think it kind of reverts back to what you were saying at the very beginning there, Rachael, a lot of the processes around this that you were talking about from the labs are equally valid, I think, to the retail space. If you don't set up your right processes and controls, structure and culture at the beginning, it is impossible to fix it when you go further down. I think it's an extremely fantastic statement, and one which I think is valid across the entire value chain. There we go. Well, thank you, thank you. So I think that's a key dynamic, and for us, I think the first piece as regards to this is very much around who do we work with. So I would go so far as to say at this point in time, about 92, 93% of people which are launching new products within the European markets in particular, we simply say, you know, you just don't tick enough of the boxes for us to be sure that you're going to be able to do this thing properly over the longer run. And as the largest retailer globally, we have a responsibility to set a tone, because then a lot of other retailers will follow our lead as regards to if you're with us, you must be good. So hence we have to be careful with allowing something out there. The other dynamic to it as well is that in addition to, and we do this even for products which are submitted into the FDA, even for products which are coming from very credible manufacturers, which is the vast majority of our sales, coming from the largest 5 tobacco players in the world, makes up the vast majority of our sales, we will still pick out products and send them off for independent testing with laboratories before we will list them for our consumers, and then we will pick random samples from batches every 90 days as it goes through.
Oh, wow.
And we do that, of course, we recognize that for the vast majority of the manufacturers, there will never be an error, but occasionally there might be an error from one or two, but it's also a great validation for the consumer, because this is a complex category. People are always a little bit nervous as regards to what the relationship with nicotine and their health will be, and the quality control of the products. And I also think perhaps the industry still has a bit of a journey to go when it comes to repairing its reputation, perhaps, from some of what happened over the last 5 to 7 decades within this space. So I think it's always great for the consumer to know that not just was the product okay from a regulator's perspective, but when it was sent off for independent consumer testing, it met the standards on that, and that the test results are published, and they can take a look at them on our stores themselves.
Yeah. In some respects, product stewardship 101, but in other respects, an amazing innovation. Willie.
No, those are great comments, Gavin. There's one risk I didn't hear us talk about, and that's risk to the consumer. We've talked about innovation, and you talked about product testing, but I will say that in the U.S., because of the rather complex and challenging regulatory environment, the majority of the products on the market are illicit or illegal, and they're not being tested. In addition, when it comes to innovation, people are not innovating necessarily with legal products, but innovating to develop products that are not regulated. So using nicotine alternatives. Now, that poses a risk if they don't do testing. There are some people that are, I would say, they are doing testing, or they're parallel launching and testing, which I wouldn't necessarily advise. But we do have some challenges here when it comes to the fact that not a lot of products are being authorized to compete with the illegal products that are coming in from overseas.
Yeah, or the products that are being manufactured to not be subject to some of those regulatory jurisdictions with novel molecules. Yeah. Chris. Yes. When we talk about this, one of the things that's come up as clear is the similarities with the audit chain, right? We're talking about the facility. If we're going to move this back to circle back to where we started, right? We're talking, because everything that we've talked about here is, even at the retail level, what Haypp Group is doing and Gavin's people are doing, they're generating records on that, and you need to be able to have those accessible. Can you talk about what are some of the learnings from the audit side, both from your experience as a state auditor, as you're going into a wholesale in your jurisdiction that sells in 30 states and has 1 million square feet in their warehouse? You go in and you've got to dig through that audit trail. They've got to have all the records there. If you get to a manufacturer, like if you're talking about Altria in Richmond, and you're talking about that facility that's churning all that stuff out, you're at the same scale and scope. What are some of the similarities? You know, you've heard on this, but what are some of the fundamentals there on the audit chain, on the record keeping part of it, that you think are directly analogous to some of these regulatory strictures here?
Yeah, and first, one of the things Willie said, there's a lot of illicit product on the market. From a state standpoint, you know, once these directories come in, you know, the state enforcement agents will, at that point, they'll have authority to actually take the product, and they can confiscate it. Yeah. You know, that's one.
And you're talking about some of the legislation in the states now where
correct.
Manufacturers will have to certify that they are either in process or have received authorization. I just want to. I'm sure everybody in the room knows.
But till that point, you know, until those pass, I don't see the states actually confiscating any of that product. You know, the risk there is even if they confiscate, there's still tax due on it, and so that's part of the you know, so that still is there.
Death and taxes?
Yeah. Just because you had your product taken doesn't mean you don't owe tax.
Yeah.
Back to the record keeping side, you know, one of the things that we would do when we'd go into, let's say, a wholesaler, we would actually walk around the wholesaler and talk to the employees, and actually back in the warehouse, similar to what you're talking about when you're talking to the machine manufacturers, because we want that, you know, you want to get a feel of how the product is coming in there, how it's, who touches it. You know, at some point, a lot of the wholesalers, they have theft in there. You know, there's stories where, you know, a lot of people would go out and they'd go to a house party afterwards, and some guy is selling cartons of Marlboro cigarettes that he took from his employer. You know, that happens. And so what happens to that product? So that's why we want to go and talk and see what's going on with the product in the warehouse. Also, then the record keeping that we're looking at is, do they have records? And it's not just an invoice. Do they have shipping documents? Do they have, you know, what documents do they have to back up what they got? And is it accessible for the auditors? Some states want 100% paper. They do not want electronic records, and so that all has to be stored somewhere. When we're talking about some of the you know, the FDA stuff, you have to store that records. Do you have is it accessible when a person comes in to do the audit? You know, we're doing you know, you can do a lot of stuff ahead of time because sometimes there's third-party records, and so you already know going in what that person should be reporting or telling you. And so there's a lot of that stuff you can check ahead of time before you go in, and so, you know, so you know what you're looking for, and if they don't give it to you, it's sort of, you know, but it's just mainly talking to a lot of the people and making sure they have the records, whether it's electronic or paper, if a state allows the electronic records. Yeah. You know, do they give you full access to it, or do they only give you certain parts of it? You know, I want this one, but they're not going to let you go through it. You know, it's going to question more, are they giving you everything or not?
Sure. And I think it's interesting because I see a lot of parallels in these two processes.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about record keeping requirements from the GMP, TPMP standpoint, if you look at the 10 subparts of the TPMPs, there's a section on record keeping within most of them. And it's not just keep a record, it's the first GMP type proposed regulation where they use the ALCOA acronym. Don't know who else is familiar with ALCOA, but it's accurate, legible, contemporaneously recorded, original. And so they're not just expecting that you keep a record, it has to be a good record. And the implication with ALCOA, if you're talking about electronic records, is that, you know, it's essentially a validated electronic record. So the expectation around record keeping is pretty intense in the proposed TPMPs, because it's not just keep a document, it's that you have an appropriate record and that you retain it. So, I mean, there's requirements to retain the records, you know, beyond the shelf life of the product, if a shelf life is used. So, yeah.
And be able to recall it. So I think that's the thing that I've always tried to wrap my head around with this, especially in terms of the risk, is even for the larger companies that have a lot more resources to be able to do it, is how are you going to manage the sheer amount of record, especially under the ALCOA system, because it needs to be contemporaneous. That doesn't mean you know, Bob's done with his shift, and then he fills out a clipboard with all the stuff that he did in the shift. That means that as product is coming off the line, there is some sort of record being generated, and then that is accessible. Because I think that's the other part of this, is the accessibility. Going back to the QA discussion we have, you know, yeah, great, do all the QA stuff, everything's in spec or everything's not in spec, but how do you, because FDA is going to want to see that when they show up. And that's the part that I really struggle to wrap my head around in terms of the blinking red risk factor for all size players that are subject to this as it comes in.
Yes, with different levels of systems. You know, you have the bigger manufacturers who are mostly electronic, and most of them are validated Part 11 type compliance system, and that's easier. But then you have the really small manufacturers who are just paper, and trying to retrieve that paper. You know, FDA inspectors generally expect it within 24 hours, even if it's from 2 years ago and you are keeping it off site. So you have to challenge that practice that you can obtain these records quickly, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, especially when I think about like some of the pipe manufacturers, like the small pipe manufacturers, and some
Try
of
to
those
make
things.
a batch record.
Well, even the cigar manufacturers, where their cigars are stored probably for years, you know, they can be stored for a long time as long as they're stored properly. So where's the record from when they first got that particular product?
Yeah, it would be challenging if that becomes in scope. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm hoping it's not. I'm hoping they're not going to retrospectively apply that, because, but.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move down the chain a little bit. I want to open up. Have we raised anything? Is everyone still awake first? No. Have we raised any questions? Does anybody have any questions for our panel thus far? Because we've gone from basically facility to product to facility to we're touching on the shelf. We've stuck our toe into retail as well in terms of the value chain. Does anybody have any questions for our panel that's come up? No. Okay. Well, we'll move on that. Before we move off this into other areas, we've touched on a little bit, but I want to go back for a second on product life cycle, right? Because Gavin, you talked about in Europe, and when I was at TPE this year, at the TPE conference that Concilium hosted, we had a speaker from Imperial there, and they talked about the frenetic pace of white pouches in the European market, and the fact that you're looking at a line extension a month being launched for a year, you know, per brand family, which is just insane. And I think that's what you were kind of alluding to, is just the scale and scope of what's happening out there. When we talk about this in terms of the life cycle of a product, right? Let's take a step back from that maybe level of frenetic pace. Going back to the U.S., we're not going to be able to do that, right? You're not going to have that frenetic pace. But whenever you're talking about life cycle and you're talking about risk in the life cycle, and I want to start at the shelf and work back this time. For you, what is the key? What are some of the keys that you're looking at when you do this validation, when somebody comes in and pitches, or even if you're looking at the big guys and saying, you know, hey, what's the deal here? What are some of the keys for you in terms of how you look at how they manage their life cycle?
Yeah, I think...
and drawing on your past experience as well, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe to contextualize this, I spent almost a decade in the industry before I moved into this space. This is unrecognizable relative to what the industry went through with traditional tobacco products. You know, there was a sort of a mindset. I've often sort of paraphrased this one for some of my team, for the Scandinavians occasionally, who recognize it a little bit less. You know, it's been a long time ago since a, you know, Confederate Army captain got off the back of a horse in the middle of Winston-Salem and decided he was going to start machine manufacturing cigarettes. And I always said that, you know, that was pretty much the second last innovation I think I saw within cigarettes over 160 years. I think the next one probably came in the 50s when somebody started applying a filter to it.
Yep.
Of course, there might have been various angles in the last 2 decades where people started putting capsules in until people very politely asked them to take them back out. But you're dealing with a fundamentally different life cycle here. And there was also a very different relationship between the consumer and the brand. people often used a brand for the vast majority of their life as it went through. You're dealing with a completely different dynamic on this at this point in time. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I'm seeing people using alternating brands in the same given day.
Yeah.
Often because during the day, and I guess this is valid for a lot of stimulants along the way, whether it's caffeine or anything else. At different points in time of the day, you want to alter your stimulant level a little bit as it goes through. So that's varying here. So I think the dynamics in this, I'm not going to make a prediction on how it's going to pan out, apart from saying I would make a prediction that it's going to be very, very different versus what the traditional nicotine industry looked like in this space. And I think everybody is clamoring to try and understand how to navigate this as it goes forward, because there's a fundamental need for an acceleration in the culture, or a culture that appreciates acceleration in the pipeline as it goes through here. It's requiring an entirely different dynamic, and the share of spend which is going into R&D is fundamentally different versus what it was before. I think I also see a dynamic, one of the pieces that, of course, we talk about our data being regularly used for consumer insights, where we're the largest provider in that space as well. But the other space where our data is often used is on strategic M&A, where some of the large five will use our data to determine from some of the second-tier players which businesses are actually worth acquiring based on the strength of the brand and the cohorts coming through on it. And one of the side effects that I see coming through on this was that historically the nicotine industry ran an M&A policy, certainly we'll say since the mid to late 1960s, of general consolidation. It was take two businesses which do a relatively similar thing, add them together, strip costs out, and over time margins continue to improve with that. Now what you can see is that there's a fundamental discussion going on as regards to how to handle this pace of innovation coming in, and how much of that can be navigated by adjusting the internal culture versus how much of this should be navigated by allocating a sizable chunk of the balance sheet into simply buying innovation from the outside market as it manifests and using that as the way to bring it in.
Sure.
So I think there's probably, these are just a couple of them. I think, if anybody had a half an hour to listen to me bore them, I probably have about 8 or 9 different pillars as regards to how this thing is altering over time. But I think the one thing I can say is a sort of a red line going through it all is that it is diametrically different to what the industry has experienced, certainly for the previous century and a half.
Yeah. When we think about life cycle and we think about supply chain, because that's one of the key components to a product life cycle is your supply chain. If I can step back from the international market, look at the U.S. market. Rachael and Willie, and then I'm gonna go back to you, Shelly, on the other side of it. Rachael and Willie, when we look at the supply chain and we look at the work that you do for your clients, and pulling from, because you guys both have a vast spectrum of clients, right? So we're talking, high-level generalities here. But when we talk about the value chain, when we talk about the product life cycle, when you're looking at the supply chain side, your client is coming to you and saying, okay, these are our components. This is the product we're submitting. This is the product that this is the product now. How do you reframe that discussion especially with the post-authorization world? Because if you're just looking at it one version at a time, in terms of both your supply chain for your product, from your suppliers, your inputs that are going into making the product, and then getting through the authorization path, getting to authorization and then getting to market with your product, right? If you're looking at it just as that single process and step, the feedback that I've gotten in talking with everyone in the industry is that there's a realization that way of looking at things doesn't work anymore. You need to be thinking about it when you look at your product life cycle, and then looking back at your supply chain is looking at the strategies, and you can see it. There are some players out there that are doing this strategy. Others I think will start it, where you're looking at filing for different evolutions of a product, in advance of them coming to the market, or you're doing it piecemeal or things like that. So can either of you just talk about some of the work that you do with your clients and some of the challenges that are present in, and some of the risks that are present in that real fundamental shift, kind of taking a piece from what Gavin was saying there, this real fundamental shift in how you look at not only your product life cycle, but also your supply chain, how your clients are looking at their inputs, and how that all has changed, and what the new risk factors in that are. Have I babbled, or does that make sense? Willie, you're up first. Sorry.
Yeah. Let me start by saying let's talk about the environment. If we're helping a client and they're on the market and they've submitted applications, there's very little you can do because technically, legally, you can't change the product. Now, if they're starting from the beginning, we have a lot of flexibility, and we can recommend differences in material. So I recommend screening, right? And you can iterate, change. But I think most importantly, let me step back from that, a filing strategy. Developing a filing strategy from the very, very beginning will mitigate risk. And I think PMI is expert at that. If you look at the fact that they put a product out, then the next thing you know, they got another authorization for a slightly different product. My thought is that they say, this data still applies, here's some new data for the change, put it in, FDA, thank you. They look at the new data, looks good, keep moving. Sorry. Oh yeah, somebody about a publication. There we go. So that's the thing, the filing strategy, but also being open to screening, because things will change as you go through the development process. And also I heard Mitch Steller say one time that the bar is changing. And as people innovate, they're developing new and newer technologies to reduce constituents in the aerosol. So you want to make sure that when you do testing and you compare with the marketplace, which you definitely must do, that you're somewhere in the middle or toward the bottom, not at the very top in terms of HPHC. So it's an iterative process, and my clients seem to accept this. Again, the challenge is products that are currently on the market. It's very difficult to put the cat back in the bag.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with Willie. I think that there are things that need to be considered. A filing strategy is absolutely number one. You need to, before you even start building your product, you need to understand where you're trying to go and have a clear plan on how you're going to get there. And that includes how you're going to file. Pilot testing, screening testing, absolutely critical. Number one thing that I think everyone needs to remember is that ingredients are not created equally, and we've seen that most recently with things like synthetic nicotine and the tobacco-derived nicotine. Not everything is created equally. Make your choices carefully, test your products. If you find a problem, have a backup plan, know where you're going to go next. Not all pods are created equally, not all gaskets, wicks, coils. These things have to be assessed both independently but also as a whole in your entire product, because they do pose risks. You need to know how much so that you can make decisions. When you get, as Willie's talking about, you don't want to be at the top. You don't want to be kissing the bar at the top. And being just under what people will accept.
Yeah.
And so it's critical that you plan for that. It's critical that you consider it when you're designing your product. Had a call recently with a client who wanted, a bulletproof formulation. Tell me what I'm allowed to put in. Tell me what I'm allowed to do. Tell me the levels I'm allowed to use, the flavors I'm allowed to use, and honestly, there is no magic formula, because if there was, I think we'd all be using it if we possibly could. If there was a guaranteed passing grade out there, we stole the cheat sheet from Todd Cecil over there in the corner, then, it's kind of like high school. We'd have all shared it around. People would know. But that isn't how it works. So you have to make decisions based on the appropriate amount of risk that you feel you can incorporate in your design, and where you can mitigate that risk, and in some instances where you can avoid it altogether. You can make the choice not to use an ingredient that you know is on the HBHC list or is a known carcinogen. Make the choice.
Chris, let me add one other quick thing to that, and that is the importance of vendors having solid quality systems. The reason I say that is a vendor can give you their best piece of material, and you test it, works great. But then the product is made, and you're like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
Because you tested a sample that was fantastic, and they have no quality system. They're not producing materials in a quality way, and you're not getting the same material. So this is, as a toxicologist, I say, my tests are only as good as the quality system that supports the material.
Yeah, yeah. And Shelly, if I can loop you into this, do you have something?
Well, a few things on
Before
that. So talking about it from a supplier standpoint, with the increasingly complex global supply chain, the relationship you have with your suppliers are very important. And when you're assessing suppliers, you have to consider the risk. So is the supplier in a country of low regulatory oversight? What does their history look like? You know, have they had recalls? If you've worked with the supplier, what's their performance history like? And then depending on the level of the risk of the supplier, you also need to look at the level of risk of the ingredient. Is it a critical ingredient? Is it not? You as a manufacturer may need to apply some additional scrutiny. So it's not always a one-size-fits-all process when you're qualifying suppliers. You may need to do extra testing for those with higher risk and less with those with lower risk, and it doesn't stop once you qualify them. There needs to be an ongoing process where you're looking at these things on a frequent basis. So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I was going to ask you about that, especially thinking with your TPMP hat on, right?
Yep.
Is the importance of bringing procurement into this and bringing
Yes.
redundancy into that. Because I remember one of the most humiliating moments that your boss Dean pulled on me when I was still in industry at that mock inspection was the tail of guar gum, which was used as a tipping adhesion. And the issue that came up with it was in being able to document the identical cast number because the one supplier we were using stopped making it. And the fact that at that point we realized we needed to build in more redundancy and flexibility in our purchasing contracts to be able to source that. So can you just elaborate a little bit on that, especially in a
I wrote down
TPMP
some
world?
notes, and kind of that's one of the things I wrote down is being single source is a high risk, and I know sometimes it takes more work up front to qualify more than one supplier, but you know, COVID I think taught us all that if you lose a supplier, I mean, it can shut down your manufacturing. So it does take a little bit more work, and this is always from a former quality professional, you know, working with procurement. There's always a little, you know, there's cost discussions and availability discussions, but you have to kind of look at it holistically. All of those things need to come into play when you're qualifying suppliers.
Yeah.
By the way, Chris, you incorporate that into your filing strategy and your testing plan as well to make sure you have data on those alternate materials so that you can switch suppliers if you definitely need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to follow on with what Shelly said is when you start talking about cost, everybody gets a little twitchy. But I think one of the critical things, and Willie and I, laboratories are expensive. Nobody wants to do more testing than they have to do. But the other part of that is quality components and parts tend to be more expensive as well. If you find a supplier that's willing to give you the same for half the cost, the adage of it's, you know, if it sounds too good to be true, you need to remember that because you will save on money, but you will sacrifice in quality, or as Willie commented on consistency in quality as well.
Yeah, one of the main risks I've learned is guys like Gavin are testing, are watching you.
Well, there you go.
And you don't want to get delisted from Haypp Group.
You know, and those risks get incorporated in your application, but in a post-market environment, they also end up causing adverse events.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes severe ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Jessica, when we're talking about changing product and life cycle, we often stop there. Don't go on to the consumer side. What's a strategy that mitigates risk in terms of the evolution of the product. You know, how do you deal with your client when they're talking about, if you have a client that's got that submission strategy, right? They're looking out ahead, they're looking at something new. Where does the behavioral part of it, where does the marketing part of it come in? Because I think that's another thing that gets lost in this. You know, the marketing component, especially from submission through to post-market, like that gets lost in it. Put those pieces back in there, because I think, again, that back to that silo analogy, I think we often get siloed with it, and that just gets bolted on, but I don't think that really manages the risk in the right way.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what I said earlier, which is finding and listening and making sure you have some type of system in place where you're listening to your consumers. And I guess that's probably the marketing side of companies, but me, never been in the marketing side. I don't know necessarily, or the consumer in the marketing side is very different than the regulatory science. But being able to take, we like to call them pulses. So pulsing your consumer, what are they liking? What don't they like? Being able to hold, and really these kinds of studies are not that expensive too, being able to hold mini focus groups and talking to your target audiences about what is the current generation of your product, what would they like to see, what don't they like. And going back to psychology, you know, human behavior, we tend to do what we've always done, right? So we like familiarity. We like people that look like us. We're just gonna keep doing that, and we're just gonna say, I'm gonna keep doing that. I'm gonna keep drinking Diet Pepsi. So it's very interesting, because companies who are able to tap into the focus groups and the qualitative and the psychology will actually find their best innovations happening when someone tells you that they want to, someone doesn't tell you what they want, but you create it for them, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, that's exactly it. But when you actually try and get it out of them by words, they fail to tell you. And so innovation truly is at the best for companies that hold these focus groups, tap into your consumers, or not your consumers, right, but really your target audience. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I was thinking of, we talk a lot here about PMTAs, and we talk about next generation products. But I also think the substantial equivalence pathway, you know, some clients believe that the best thing is to change something and, hey, let's just get the application in, and they're gonna sit on it for several years, and here we are. But not recognizing that there is a critical behavioral component to the substantial equivalence pathway and application. And when you change something fundamental, of your product, even though your product developers internally have tested it and you have equivalency and they can't tell the difference between X and Y, you have changed a component of your product. And your product developers or whoever else you have that are doing, you know, pilot testing are not the same people as your consumers. And so there is 100% a behavioral component of, for example, iterating and innovating through changes within, and that might be your flavor contributor has, you know, no longer is developing your flavor, so you're gonna have to go somewhere else. You just never know what a small change that you might think is small is actually a difference with consumers. And oftentimes it's not, but it's still important to do that behavioral work.
My first ever experience with a focus group, the company that I worked for was reverted in the very early days of substantial equivalence for combustible products, reverted back to the grandfather spec. We were able to reverse engineer it and have everything work on that. One of it involved was, at the time, was a packaging change. It was before we had kind of settled on the packaging change. It wasn't a revolutionary design. It was more of the choice of the coloration, right? It was shades of color. When we finished that project, we got a call from our marketing people, and they were furious. And I said, what's going on? And they said, well, you come to a focus group. I came to a focus group, and the consumers were telling us that the product tasted different because the color had changed. And they interpreted that as the taste of the cigarette was different. Just because the color, and it wasn't even like it went from red to blue. It went from, you know, red 372 to red, you know, 194 or whatever, you know, whatever the RBG would be on it. But yeah, it was crazy. And it was my first experience. I was shocked.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, you know, I think we all have individual opinions about everything, but I will say, and I don't know whether that's my public health experience being at NIH in the federal consulting world for a while, but what the FDA is asking for when it comes to this is pretty in line with what we should be doing from a scientific perspective. I mean, packaging changes, as small as we or you as an outsider or business person might think it is, I promise you, actual consumers sit down and talk with them, and they do that every single time. Is in their brains, they have created a change that is non-existent, which is also then why we'll do blinding, because then you can, right, that study design will allow us to be like, hey, it's actually behaviorally the same, but if you look at it packaging, they will notice the difference. But yeah, very important.
Yeah, I was blown away.
Hey Chris, I think you're poking at something here, and I'll just say why it's important to work with Jessica, Gavin. I would say to have a cross-functional team, because as a toxicologist doing risk assessment, risk, hazard, exposure, if I don't know what the exposure is, these guys tell me how the consumer is using the product, and they feed into exposure. They also help us communicate with the consumer, with labeling. I may see a constituent, right, and I want to communicate some information to the consumer. They help communicate, because clearly all the scientific language is not communicating. Scientists do not communicate well with consumers.
It is here.
And so, but guess what? Legal.
Yeah.
Because what's the biggest risk? The biggest risk is that you receive a marketing denial order. So you start planning your legal defense at the very beginning, right? I know you guys knew that already, but that's exactly what you do. So you have this cross-functional team that should be working closely together, respect each other's discipline, and feed into each other's discipline. That's how you mitigate the risk of an MDO.
Yeah.
I fully agree with exactly everything both of you guys are saying. Thank you. No, on a serious note on this one, I also think if you get out early and you pick up what the feedback from the consumer is, you can actually adapt the messaging quite heavily along the way. And I'm going to take of course, we do a lot of focus groups based on consumers who have behaved in certain ways. And beyond the one grouping whereby the unmet needs is not so clear, but even for those as regards to how they're going to adapt to slightly different changes. So I'm going to pick out an example of one that went through for us there a couple of years ago, which was that somebody wanted to take one of their products and put it in a substantially smaller can and see how it would go. So we popped it out to the first 10,000 consumers with 3 different messages to see where the reaction would be. One was very much hinged around the environmental, smaller can, less plastic, see how that reverted in. Another one was going to be hinged around better pocket feel, less space taken up in your pocket, see where it went from there. And the third one was longer freshness with the product, less air in the can, hence less air circulating, so it was a moist product, so hence the product would stay moist for longer because there was less air within it. Each of them resonated with 3 different groupings reasonably well as we pushed it through, but what we realized was that what was most important wasn't what message it was, but what was most important was that there was a message, because there was the preconceived idea that the consumer will automatically know why we are making this change. And it was most important to set the tone of what the message was going out. And I think it reverts back to one of the dynamics which we talk about here as regards to the ability to change the products and the restrictions we have on changing the products because of the regulatory requirement. What we have a little bit more flexibility with in this continent is perhaps the ability to manage the message. And often managing the message can help people associate different emotions within the product. And I guess this is where you were coming from on this one, Jessica, as well. And I think we need to bear in mind that not everything is set in concrete. And there's certain things we can't change, certain things we can. And I think it's high time for a degree of openness on that second chapter.
Yeah, please.
And related to that, I absolutely love that. An example would be when we talk about innovation and harm reduction and the lack of our ability. Again, I'm not sure we're tapping into the international realm, but we know specifically in the U.S. to be able to change packaging, make it clear for the consumer. A great example is, generally speaking, our research on pouches. And some cans have a top, as we all know, where you can put your used pouches. I would say the vast majority of novel consumers, 1, don't know it's there, and 2, when they do find it's there, don't know what the purpose of it is. and I'm going to make this up, and me not being the creative marketing person, imagine if it said, use the pouch, when you're done, put it here. And I know you guys are going to laugh at me, but that is the language of consumers. And to them, maybe that's an, oh my gosh, I'm not now going to have to dispose of it and find a place to put it, look all weird. Maybe I'm going to put it, like on the ground, and so maybe we're thinking environmental. But a lot of people, again, are thinking about in their heads, like, what am I going to do when I'm done with this? They'll say, do I swallow it? It's like, no, please don't. But but if we can
that would be an adverse event.
Right. If we can be very specific and change that labeling, and we can move and alter and be an agile with our consumers, imagine the innovation and the harm reduction that could happen. Yeah. Again, we also have to understand within a regulatory framework.
No, but it's funny you mention that, because the first time I ever was handed a can of Swedish snus when I went to Europe for the company that I was working for, I noticed right away the little flippy thing on the top. It took me about 15 minutes to figure out how that actually wasn't the opening for the can. And I didn't know how to open the can to see what the product looked like for about 15 minutes. I'm sitting there. It was like, I was like Ben Stiller and Owen Wilson in Zoolander when they try to open up Jerry Stiller's computer, and I'm just like banging the thing. I was like a monkey. It was ridiculous. But but yeah, it is. It's funny, those little insights that you can kind of take from that. It's really interesting. And then I think that is a nice, you guys are all segue machines today. That's a nice segue to the last part of this discussion, right? Which is how those of you that are manufacturers in the audience can help yourselves be a better client for the experts that are up here. Or in your case, Gavin, you guys are doing everything right, so you didn't need any help. But the organizational and the cultural change. I think one of the things that we talked about right off the bat was that cross-functional team, that dynamic, trying to break down the silos of that. I think that's really important. I haven't been in the industry in a few years, but when I was and we were doing this, it was siloed. You had the tox part of it, you had the material part of it, you had the emissions part of it. Sometimes they were at different back then, because I've been out of the game for a while now, but back then they were in different laboratories. Some were internal, some were external. Can we just all talk a little bit about the and even from the tax perspective, right? You go in with IGEN, you have very complex business software that goes in and helps clients manage complex licensing and complex reporting, and taking all of that data, filtering in, and spinning it back out to the regulators whilst lowering administrative burden, right? That doesn't happen right away. You come in and it's a mess. You come in, you have a product, you're coming in, there's a problem. There's something that's not working internally, or there's a process that you don't understand, that your company needs help to be able to understand and adapt to, right? So let's talk a little bit about that kind of culture change, and especially in this new environment, and we'll look at it, mainly from the US perspective, because I think it's also applicable internationally as regulations become, we're looking at TBD3 coming down the road and all those kinds of things. So I don't think this is exactly going to be confined to the US forever. But from that US perspective, what are some of the top 2 or 3 things that you see, thinking back on some of your clients and things, where you look at it and say, this part of the culture, this approach needs to change? Just a couple of little observations from your time, and I'll start with you, Chris, and we'll just run down the line.
One of the things you mentioned was licensing. Where a lot of our clients, before we got them in, we asked them, where are you storing your licenses? So when the renewal period is up, how to file it again so you can continue with that license. A lot of them say, well, it's in a drawer in the filing cabinet, or I keep track of it on Excel. Well, the problem is if you don't keep up with it, it's out of date pretty quick. So it was not an automated system. If you're able to automate it, it's a lot better for you. The other part, you said everything was siloed. We do see that a lot on the tax side, where the tax people are over here, the sales people are in a separate area. They don't talk, or the marketing department doesn't talk to the tax people to say, hey, we're going to come out with this new product. Is there tax, do we need to think about tax?
Surprise, we're selling in this state.
Yeah, and so then it can be reported properly. And a lot of their data came from, that we get, comes from, 3 or 4 or more back office systems, and they don't talk. And so a lot of that is very siloed. You know, so is it able, so you can get that data to talk together so you can actually use it in more than one area? That's really, you know, sort of the key if you can do it.
Yeah. Shelly?
Yeah, the biggest thing that comes to mind initially is around change control. So, you know, changes made at the manufacturing site level, are they properly assessed, and are the appropriate groups brought into the change? So there are little things sometimes that get changed at the manufacturing level that may not be seen as impacting product or impacting the design or development of a product, and they can, right? So you need to ensure that when you're implementing a change, that the production group is talking to the R&D or development group and the group that was involved in submitting the PMTA and the quality group, so it can all be assessed before the change is made. And we've seen this happen a lot, where somebody makes a small change like environmental controls, you know, in a manufacturing environment or in a warehouse, that ultimately impacts the stability of a product, but you don't necessarily think about that. Or in-process packaging changes that may impact product, and so that's kind of the first thing. The second thing goes back to complaints and adverse events. When you're creating a risk management file for a product, it's a living file. It's not just you create a PFEMA once and it stops, or you create a design risk analysis document once and it stops. You have to use the feedback continually from things like complaints and change controls and out of specification results, that you get to continually update that file.
Rachel?
I would say to make sure that you surround yourself with the appropriate subject matter experts when you're looking for submitting an application, and that you really do take, and this is not even a plug for this panel, a multidisciplinary approach and thought process to your risk management. There are ways to manage risk. There's no magic formula, but there are ways, and working together in different areas where you're working with manufacturing, where you're working with product design, where you're working with your toxicologist, with your abuse liability. There are ways where you can make decisions in one area that will help you manage risk, maybe in 1, 2, 3 other areas, but unless you're having those conversations, you're not necessarily going to realize those gains.
Sure. Gavin?
I guess when it comes back to what I think I would like to see change within the industry, perhaps, or what feedback I would give on that, I think there may need to be a sort of a slight cultural shift here along the way. I think we need to recognize the scale of the opportunity which is ahead for us here as an industry, which, I don't know, roughly 15 to 16 million users of harm-reduced products in this country alone at this point in time, 100 million around the world. I think when something gets to 100 million users globally, it's, you know, slightly past the fad stage. This is something which is getting towards critical mass. And I think there needs to be recognition of approaching the opportunity which is manifesting ahead of us with a much less fear and much more positivity as regards to what the opportunity will look like here. Within that, we need to recognize, as we kind of touched on earlier, that the pace of change is going to be uncomfortable relative to the pace of change of what the industry has experienced before. But the universe on the other side, if managed reasonably well, is going to be substantially better than where it was. And the opportunity, this is, you know, there's an old fable within the UK of a guy called King Canute who went to the sea to command the tide not to come in. I think at this point in time, we're beyond the stage of commanding the tide for what change will or will not occur here. It is happening anyway. Yeah. We need to be a little bit more positive with getting behind that change and working solutions out to get to there. And I think if we can adapt that as an industry, we will come out of this extremely well.
Dr. McKinney?
Up upon what Rachael said, not only is it important to work with subject matter experts, but to work with subject matter experts that understand your business. In my mind, regulatory uncertainty is the biggest risk to your business, right? And so clients that we work with, they oftentimes have to show success in order to go talk with investors and get more money. They're not just going to plop down a lot of money to go completely develop an application. So what does that mean? So when we think about the process acceptance, right, we do a little bit more than enough to get an application accepted, which, by the way, I'm totally confused as to why applications are not accepted. I mean, FDA clearly has criteria. It is Todd's gonna challenge me on this later. It's a checkbox exercise. Why don't we have the criteria? Okay, I'm off of that. Right? And so you make it through that phase, that sends investors, okay, you're moving through. Then there's filing, where I encourage people to spend a little bit more money because you need a little bit more data, right? So you're spending and building as you go. And at the current pace of review, it's working. Now, given that I'm saying this, the pace of review might increase and this strategy might not work, but we'll develop another strategy. So it's important that you work with people that not only understand their subject matter expertise in the science area, but understand your business and will help you develop a filing strategy at the beginning to navigate this course based on your budget and where you want to go.
Jessica?
Yeah, so 100% agree pretty much with everybody, but mic drop over here with Willie. No, but to be honest, I think the biggest risk right now to the industry, and me used to be in industry 6 whatever years, now 100% independent third party, position. But looking at it from now our position, I think the biggest risk is this fight or flight. And I'm not going to get too nerdy, but this, your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system, it will, when it sees or feels risk, you either run or you freeze. And I believe that is what we see a lot of people in industry doing right now. They've seen too many MDOs. They have seen, so many denials being issued. And instead of seeing it as, wow, now we have information to know exactly, I'm going to say exactly loosely, what the FDA is looking for, let's go do it, they are questioning, well, does this apply to pouches? Does this apply to blah, blah, blah? Yes, it does. That's why the government is saying it, right? That's why they're having workshops from October 2023. And if anybody that attended, it was very clearly laid out what they are expecting of your applications. And so that's the biggest risk. And then I would just second and third, the other things that are being said about having SMEs. And again, kudos, to CTP and putting out the TPPI guidance. I think we were one of the first ones that put the first TPPI in, and it was kind of pretty much mirrored to that. But in there, that's when they say, and I'm not bashing on these types of professionals and SMEs, but literally said, this is not to be done by market organizations or market researchers or marketers. This requires specific expertise to be designed within a behavioral scientific framework. And so again, not to say it can't be done outside. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is when CTP says it, my recommendation now would be, instead of running or freezing, to do it. And perhaps we will get success.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. If I can sum it up, it's basically you have to put resource allocation in things. You have to think about things holistically. You have to communicate. You have to not be afraid. But you also have to be prepared. And if you can manage to overcome the institutional friction that develops when you're pushing in those directions, you can have a better risk mitigation strategy. Does that sound kind of like where we're at? All right. A copy of this will be available for our FDA colleagues so that they can actually show that they were complimented on something at an industry event. And I really do hope that they do share it very widely back at the center. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? We finished up just a bit early. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, come on. Yes, here we go. Chris, can I take your microphone? All right. Oh, sorry, my knees locked up standing there.
Hello, my name is Uli Becker. I'm from HBI International. We make rolling papers for RYO cigarettes. And I have a question for Willie, because he mentioned something almost in passing. We are mostly in the space of SE, substantial equivalency, but I have been there where you submit something and 3 years later you get, what is it, deficiency or whatever it is called at that point, and clearly something shifted in between the submission and the deficiency. And my question now is actually, would you recommend that we find a gap so we know that, okay, I'm very proud of it in a way. We have a submission that is 5 years old. I'm kind of thinking it's like, it's my baby, it's going off to kindergarten. So is it now better to go and do an amendment? Because I know I will get deficiencies for some submissions. And then, I don't even know if those submissions are already in scientific review. So should I just proactively do and add to the pile of whatever they have, or should I wait for the deficiency and let it play out?
I do not recommend waiting for the deficiency because you have a limited amount of time. 5 years, huh? Here's what I would recommend. Here's what's happening. There's guidance coming out, there's publications coming out, and you have to do a review of your application on some frequency. Each business can determine what that frequency is, and you have to map that against new guidance, FDA presentations, seminars like this, information that's out there, and determine, this could derail my application. Perhaps I need to beef this up. Or I said this way before, the world has changed. And then you do an amendment. Once you do that amendment is part of the application. It is your PMTA. Now, you may amend a whole section, you may amend a piece of it, but I strongly recommend that you do a gap analysis.
Okay, I was probably not quite clear. What I'm doing right now, more or less, is I'm kind of preparing my amendment or so, but I'm holding it back until I get asked. And also, isn't it so that if I have an amendment, but it is already in scientific review, the amendment is not being kind of taken into consideration?
So with the process, it depends. For some clients, we've submitted up to 20 amendments, even while the product was in scientific review. Some of those amendments were considered. Sometimes we received a deficiency letter with questions, and guess what? We had already written the answer, and all we had to do was modify it. But I strongly recommend that gap analysis. It sounds like you've done that. I'd recommend an outside source, by the way. But I know you're good, Uli. I know you're good. I know you're good. But remember, we talked about the cross-functional team. So an outside source would look at it from a behavioral science, a toxicology, a chemistry, et cetera, and give you a full, comprehensive report of where they think gaps are. And then you can decide what you want to fill, when you want to fill it, if you want to wait, if you want to do it now. If you haven't done, now I know your papers, but I'm going to use this as an example. If one of the gaps is a stability study and it takes a year to do, I recommend that you start that now, right? As opposed to waiting and then only having 90 days. However, we have dealt with that in ways as well. Now, whether or not it's acceptable to be determined, where we found old product and tested that as a placeholder and started stability studies. So we're very creative, I would say.
I would also recommend, I'm not an expert, but I wouldn't anthropomorphize your submissions. You need a little detachment, Uli. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Now that my knees finally work, I can move.
My name is Sheila Cunningham. I'm with ITG Brands, and we're a cigarette manufacturer in North Carolina. My question is for Chris. Chris is more of a licensing and tax issue. I was just wondering if a state does not define a product, and therefore you have no way of classifying it, does that prevent that company from selling that product in that state, or does that just mean that that product will not be taxed?
It depends. I mean, if there's typically the definitions can be not right up front, and so what a lot of it, what I do, for some people is they'll send me, hey, here's a question for this state, then I'll send it in, and then I'll get the answer. So then it's sort of anonymous, and then send it back to you, because I typically would ask the state, where would this product fall? Because then you're going to get the actual answer from them. Recently, Maine went back and forth. For an example, on if it contained nicotine, they were taxed, then it wasn't. Now they're going back to the definition where nicotine is now taxed in there. So it may not be taxed at this point, but it may be down the road in a couple months that they may change their mind. And so some of that comes in there. But the other part is some states you have to run certain products through the Attorney General's office first and get them approved there. So you'd want to make sure with that jurisdiction, is it a taxable product or not, and do I have to register anywhere else?
You're a TMA member, so we also have our tax guide available that you can look at the regulations and start your determination there. Anyone else?
Can I just add something to kind of expand upon some of the questions and statements up here? Talking about how the FDA and regulator has seemed to have changed their opinion along the way, and how we can go from submission in 2010, 2018, and why is it not the same? Agreed, understood. But I also just want to add that that's also science. And so with new science and new advancements and new data and new knowledge, things change. And so that's just kind of when you get in that industry and space, that's just part of what you accept along the way.
Hi, Todd Cecil, FDA. I had two questions or comments. Willie, your statement that it's important to engage your lawyers as you're developing your product with the presumption that if you get an MDO, you're going to sue. What do you think that does to an FDA reviewer and an FDA authorization authority? And I'll let you think about that. And I think, Jessica, from a psychological perspective, what do you think happens? 5 years is not out of the question from that. And number two, I think that the other thing when we talk about you and your organization, especially on deficiency letters, when we're asking questions through a deficiency letter, it's very cut and dried in terms of asking the question. We ask them very legalistically for obvious reasons, and we're asking for help because we misunderstood something or it isn't clear what your intentions were. And we want to understand what it is. Too often we get back the, well, you bunch of assholes, you're not paying attention to us. And it's the tone of those responses are that basic. And so I think there is a psychological component there. Yes, we are being difficult, but that's what we're supposed to do. And we are looking for help, and that's what a deficiency is. Help us understand your product so we can say yes. We're not trying to say no. So I just wanted to see if that is something that comes up in your assessments or when you work with companies.
Thank you very much for engaging, especially on that comment, Todd. I threw that out there specifically for engagement. First, let me say that I know some of the reviewers at FDA, and it's a tough job, and they are doing a fantastic, fantastic job. They're good scientists. They're very good scientists. Those are not the people that I'm talking about. Let's be clear. Secondly, the environment currently, the manufacturers didn't necessarily create the environment. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. 23 products authorized, and haven't seen some of the reasons for products not being authorized or not being accepted, could have been a phone call. Now, that said, I recently had a conversation about a 4057A form. It was a beautiful conversation, and things were clearly explained. We thanked FDA for it, and we will definitely do the form the right way, the way they expect it to be done. That's the type of correspondence I expect, rather than you didn't do the form correctly. We're not accepting. Take your product off the market. Fire all the people that work for you and close your doors. That is what's happening. That is why I do advise, when we start putting together an application, we need to think about the outcome, that the probabilities, the numbers show that the probability of success is extremely low. It is, even for someone like me that I think I know what I'm doing. And I have people on my staff that have sat on the same side of the fence that you're on, and we're still struggling. So, and I say that honestly as a consultant. It is challenging. It is a challenging environment. So you work with legal. It's not that you don't want that outcome, but you certainly need to prepare for it. The numbers suggest that. We can talk more later. I'm sure we will.
So I'd like to add something. I've known Todd for a long time, but I do want to sort of just attach onto something that he just said. You know, when they're looking for clarification, a lot of the time, and I can honestly say this, having come from 12 years at CTP, a lot of the time it isn't a negative thing. In all honesty, who wouldn't like the opportunity, if they're misunderstood, to better explain what they were trying to say or accomplish? Definitely, if it's a request for more data, it can be complicated in a 90-day time frame. A lot of businesses aren't built that way. You cannot do, as Willie pointed out, a 12-month time course stability study in 90 days. I've tried, it doesn't work. But that aside, some of the clients that we work with at Chemular, one of the things that we really try and explain to them is that there is risk in applying. There are risks at all stages. But if you're given information, and Jessica said this very well, much better than I'm saying it, if you are given information, if you are given guidance, follow it to the best of your ability. If you don't follow it, explain why you didn't follow it. You may have a very good reason. It may be completely acceptable to FDA that you didn't do exactly what they were asking, but you have to tell them. They're pretty decent people, but they're not mind readers. You have to tell them why. And if it's at all possible for you to follow the guidance, the recommendations, the requirements, follow them. It is the simplest way, in a very weird way, to lower your risk, is to follow the directions that are provided.
My challenge is not the directions, Rachel. My challenge is when you put together a 20,000-page document, there will be some minor errors within that document. And amazingly, people find them, and they're administrative errors. And rather than talking to you about them, they make a decision. That is my challenge.
Again, sorry. I did want to add, when you receive a deficiency letter, if it's unclear what it is that we're asking for, you can ask questions. Send in a request for more information. Ask, we didn't understand what this request was for, give us some more information. And Willie, you said it earlier on. It's very clear what we need from an RTA or for an acceptance. We list out everything that has to be there, and it's not a lot. The forms that are in Chinese need to be translated with a translator signing off that this is translated appropriately. An individual needs to sign it. We need to have everything in English because we don't read any other language, et cetera. I mean, it is a relatively few things that must be there. And the 8047 has been a stumbling block. But the problem is that when we receive 27 million applications, and we have a staff of 45 people to deal with that. We have to have systems in place to say yes or no quickly, because it's going to take more than 5 years to get to an SE. It's going to take 15 or 20 years to be able to even process the number of applications that came in the door. We hope to get to the point where this is not an issue. We hope to get to the point where we don't have to be on the phone with every manufacturer for every application that comes in. Can we write our documents better? Probably. And we are certainly working on that. And so that's a place for feedback from the industry. Where are we confusing? And help us out with that.
Todd,
that's okay. I'm going to
I need to comment on that. I agree with you. I think eliminating the applications that were written in crayon, beautiful. Do it, right? I consider myself to be pretty good at this. We were both trained at one of the best companies, and we are pretty good at it, and probably know any guidance, anything that you've put out, and try to follow it to the letter of the law, right? I still struggle, just being fair with you. And any other consultant that says that they don't struggle, I challenge them on that. So perhaps we need to communicate more. There's a gap there somewhere.
All right. Well, that's one of the reasons why we're here today, and tomorrow and the day after. TMA this year has taken an approach, as we have in the last couple of years, to try to offer a solutions-based approach. Raise issues constructively, but also offer solutions. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is the give and take. And so, Todd, we really appreciate you being here today and